Hello, and thank you very much for joining me. The purpose of this video is to answer the question, what exactly are the elements of political and social protest writing? Which is a term that if you're studying this module in the second year of your A-level, it's probably a term that you've heard a lot. If you have watched my recent video about what exactly are the aspects of comedy, this video follows the same format, which is it reminds you of what is genre study at A-level and then gives you a list of the aspects or the elements themselves for you to then use in your responses or your thinking regarding the text that you have studied for this module. We have to remember at A-level that A-level is all about not just studying the text, although that of course is very important to know the text really well, but we also are studying the genre. And if you're studying comedy or tragedy or crime writing or PSP, meaning political or social protest writing, it's the same. You are interpreting the text through the lens of that genre. So you're not just studying the text when you are studying English literature, you're also studying the genre. And that is because the examiner, to hit particular criteria specifically for AO4, they want you to make connections. A-level literature is all about making connections as part of your discussion of the text. So in your political and social protest writing essays, you are connecting the elements of the genre with the texts. And that demonstrates that you not only know the elements of PSP, but you also know the genre from which they come. And that's important as well. And then in an essay, you demonstrate both knowledge of the texts and also the genre by engaging with the texts appropriately and critically, and also answering the question confidently and appropriately. So that is the art of an A-level essay, particularly this course. It's not just about the text, it's also connecting the text to the genre. And that's the same regardless of the module you're studying at A-level. It's important to know the typical features, let's say, of a particular genre. If you studied Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet at GCSE, you might be familiar with the aspects of the Gothic, for example, or aspects of tragedy. So all genres have the same ingredients, so to speak, and it's about knowing those in order to speak about them in the exam. It's worth bearing in mind as well that the examiner will often use these elements in order to write the questions. Not always, but particularly for paper 2 section C, but also for the unseen extract, paper 2 section A of literature spec B. These terms are more important, I would argue, than section B, because with section B, whereas they might ask you about a particular element like this, they might also pick on a particular character, in which case the knowledge of the genre will flow into your essay at some point. So here we have the start of the list. The list is quite extensive because there's lots of possible themes or elements that that could come up. So freedom and emancipation essentially mean the same, setting yourself free. I'm not going to go through all of these because I think some of them are relatively straightforward. There is always a degree sometimes of injustice in a text like this, something that isn't right. And there's also often a degree of radicalization or brainwashing, which is a powerful elite which are rewiring people's thinking and rewiring their perceptions of the world in order to be more successful in whatever they are doing. You're going to get a fair degree of unfairness, and that can be aimed at a particular group of people. Democracy, or what is democratic, is important. You might, for example, have studied the French Revolution if you're studying Blake's poetry, and the ethos of the revolution, things like liberty and freedom and so on, and the rights of the individual, the rights of man. And within democracy, of course, comes the freedom to protest and the freedom of speech, the right to have an elected government, the right to a fair trial, all these kind of democratic principles that we sometimes take for granted in a democratic state. There might also be a degree of manipulation or lies being told, if it's from a particular elite figure. It can also be seen as corruption. And the rule of law as being sacrosanct or being something that is, I suppose, warped or manipulated or corrupted to suit the agenda of a particular regime. Some more here. You might have censorship, where people are in effect gagged, they can't speak their mind. Or you might have texts, of course, literature itself that has been censored or changed. You might have a lot of sacrificial characters, for example, characters that sacrifice themselves or their own safety for others. There is always a degree of those with power and those without. And those with power could be a political leader, could be a prime minister, could be a judge, could be a king or queen, but it could also be a more domestic figure, like a husband, as is the case with the doll's house. So it doesn't always have to be these grand figures of power. They can also be more in the small world, to do with domestic, more of a domestic sphere. There has already been a question about the failure of institutions, the institution of the church, the institution of government, I'm thinking here of Blake, and so on. Hegemony is a form of power, exercising control and power over others, and language that shows power over others is called hegemonic language. There could be restrictions, marginalization, liberty is important. And you might have characters as well who are motivated by some kind of nationalistic agenda or an extremist agenda, a far-right agenda, for example, as is the case with Asif in The Kite Runner and the morals of the Taliban. In terms of literature, it's important to think about narrative perspective. Who is telling the story? Has the writer chosen the narrator to be the inferior, oppressed person? Or is the narrative told from the point of view of the powerful elite? That's obviously a conscious choice. There's often a lot of children in political and social protest texts because children are synonymous with innocence in the Blakean sense. The idea of innocence being sacrosanct and idealistic. And if you have children, like in The Kite Runner, for example, being hugely affected by war, or in Blake, hugely affected by child labour or exploitation or cruelty, then those characters are going to chart the fall from freedom and the fall of childhood, which you could link to the fall of man, like a doomed, hopeless future. So children are important for charting the corruption of innocence. Settings are important, including nature and the city. Those two are often at odds. Again, if you think of Blake, you have the bucolic idealism of the pastoral and the green world, versus the city like in London, where the majority of the suffering was seen to take place. And that's also the case in other texts as well, such as Harvest maybe, or indeed in The Kite Runner, and the depiction of Afghanistan before war and after it. PSP texts can also be theocratic. They can also present religious degree of religiousness, so to speak, which is either religion that is seen as a comforting thing and God as a saviour-like figure or a Jesus kind of sacrificial figure, or it's also seen as almost like a totalitarian thing, like in The Handmaid's Tale, where the Old Testament has been warped in order to suit the Gilead's agenda. Religion, of course, is usually supposed to be a personal thing, but sometimes religion is used as a weapon to hit people over the head with, and incentivize and legitimize some kind of cruelty or persecution. So religion can be a positive thing, but it can also, in the wrong hands, becomes divisive and it can be weaponized. In PSP text, there can also be the conflict between the personal and the political, and also the micro, small world, versus the macro, large world. So often the lives and the experiences that individuals experience will often be a result of something that's going on in the broader scheme of things, in the broader society, from which they have really no control as individuals. So, for example, the corruption and the cruelty seen in the Gilead, for example, in The Handmaid's Tale, affects what Offred is, what's happening with Offred and Moira and the handmaids more generally. Same thing with Helma and Nora in The Doll's House. The institution of marriage in that text is affecting what we see in terms of the relationship in that house with that couple. And the same thing with the slave trade, for example, in Blake's The Little Black Boy, the Chimney Sweeper poems, but also the Kite Runner in terms of the corruption and cruelty and the prejudice of the Taliban and how that affects the characters themselves, like the Hazaras. And also early in the text as well, how Asif's nationalistic agenda foreshadows his later involvement in the Taliban, which can cause harm on a grander scale. Misogyny and sexism, and as I said, settings as well. And finally, often political and social protest texts depict a dystopian existence, and what's always interesting is that obviously a political aim is to achieve a utopia. We all want to live in the best possible place. However, nobody quite agrees on what that is. So each political party has a different vision. The issue is, how are they going to achieve that vision? What are they prepared to do to achieve that vision? And who is it going to affect negatively on? So, for example, if you think of Nazism, part of Hitler's vision, utopian vision, was to destroy and exterminate the Jewish race. That's going to be a dystopian existence if you happen to be Jewish. So the question is not always necessarily what is the vision, it's how are they going to achieve it, and what is the fallout going to be, what is the conflict. An ideologue is somebody's own ideology, and there are a number of characters that are persistent and tenacious in that ideology. However, that ideology may not always be the fairest for certain people. A demagogue is quite a useful word, and I've got the definition here. A political leader who seeks support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. So it's a leader that plays on people's prejudice and emotional weaknesses, perhaps. So if you know you've got a population who hates immigrants and are concerned about immigration, then you're going to be using lots of inflammatory language to suggest immigrants are your worst enemy. Draconian, authoritarian, totalitarian always kind of mean the same, which is living in a state or a place where there is a supreme leader who appears to be immune from any kind of challenge. Anti-clericalism, which means kind of an anti-religious or rejection of religion, that you could argue, for example, at the end of A Doll's House, Nora becomes a bit of an anti-cleric becomes a bit anti-clerical because she rejects this idea that religion is keeping her in the house as a wife and mother. And despotism is the exercise of absolute power, especially in a cruel and oppressive way. So that's also sometimes quite useful. Because political and social protest texts are about real events, things that have actually happened, we say that they have a lot of social realism. They are about things that are actually real places, real events in history, which gives them a controversial edge and sometimes makes them ripe for kind of censorship or banning. And in fact, pretty much all of the texts on the PSP reading list for this course are probably banned in many places right now across the world because they conflict with what the government want the people to be reading. And that leads me to my last point, which is a point that I made recently in another video, which is that in the United Kingdom, where we're studying political and social protest writing, we're very lucky to be studying this and to have access to these texts. Because actually, in some places in the world, including some places in the United States, which is supposed to be the beacon of the free world, some of these texts are banned and you cannot read them or they're hidden. And there have been stories of teachers that have been sacked because they have given students a text which conflicts with what the Republican government wants the citizens to be exposed to. So this module, Political and Social Protest Writing, is very real, and it's an enjoyable module to teach actually because there's always something going on in the world now that's relevant to this. These issues have been there, for a very long time, so it's always relevant this module. So those are the elements of political and social protest, and the idea is, as we go back to the beginning, you're connecting these elements to the texts that you study in order to demonstrate that you know why these texts come under this particular heading of political and social protest writing. So hopefully that was useful, and good luck with your studies. Thank you for watching.